go ahead and build on what we talked about before with the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany and in Italy. And we're going to lead right up into World War II. So I'll back up first. And what we've been talking about is that dictatorships seem to be the way of the future. You can see on this map that democracies, those are losing ground because a lot of people think they're just not well suited to solve the problems of the 20th century. So Germany has gone from democracy to dictatorship, and so have a lot of the Balkan countries. So the place to start here is with what happens right after World War I. Right after World War I, it looks like things are going to work out, that there's not going to be another conflict. So the Locarno Pact in particular was an agreement that all European countries signed. They agreed that they were fine with the borders that had come out of World War I, and so the Germans signing the Locarno Pact was a big deal because the Versailles Treaty had been forced on the Germans. The Locarno Pact had not. They had voluntarily signed that they agreed with the borders as they had been drawn at Versailles. And so it just didn't seem like there could be another war. And in particular in democracies, there was the feeling that nobody would be crazy enough to start another war, that these wars were so destructive that it would be suicide for the country, but it would also be political suicide if you engaged in this. And so the leaders of democracies failed to see how a totalitarian leader wouldn't necessarily have to get public opinion behind him in kind of the democratic way. So the democracies of the day, we're talking about Britain and France and the United States as the leading democracies, they are not going to be all that willing to enforce the Peace of Versailles because they've taken a more pacifist path. So meanwhile, we have aggression on the part of these totalitarian leaders. And so what we are going to see over the 1930s is what we could call unchecked aggression. Nobody is going to step up and uphold international peace. And so this period of the 1930s is a good lesson as far as what does happen if nobody is willing to stand firm and hold countries to a certain line. And there's a power vacuum. And when there's a power vacuum, countries are going to fill that power vacuum and they're going to do what they want to do. And so this is exactly what we see in the 1930s. This has been a powerful lesson for countries ever since World War II. No country, no leading country out there wants to revert to this kind of system. So let's take a look at what's going on. So the one thing I mentioned already, the United States, the British, the French, they don't want to enforce Versailles. So the British and the French had signed the Peace of Versailles, which limited the German military, it limited German territory, it forced the Germans to pay reparations. And by the time we get to the 1930s, British and French politicians have come to see the Peace of Versailles as being too harsh. And so they're not willing to push Germany on the Peace of Versailles because that could lead to war. And so that, though, is the law of the land, the Peace of Versailles. It constitutes international law. So what is the law that the democracies are going to uphold? That isn't clear. On the totalitarian side, you have this intense nationalism, and so we've fascist takeover in Italy, fascist takeover in Germany. Fascism is an ultra-nationalistic ideology. You want to show that your nation is the best. And so one way to do that is through conquest, through war. That it was thought by fascists. And so looking at this as part of the big picture, nationalism was a cause of World War I. The nationalist issues that caused World War I were not resolved adequately by the Peace of Versailles, and so they end up causing a second war. And so the post-World War II agreements are going to focus pretty strongly on this idea of nationalism and how it caused wars. So just to kind of give you an idea of how this works, this is a document about the Japanese invasion of China. All right, so this document is an excellent illustration of several things that we have going on here. So the first is Japanese nationalism. The Japanese, during the period after World War I, had actually bought into that same system I described the democracies as buying into, that international law and treaties could prevent another major war. And so in the 1920s, there were politicians in Japan that wanted to get the resources Japan needed through trade, not through conquest. Then the Great Depression hits, and the United States basically walls itself off, and the Japanese feel betrayed by Western countries who are much more concerned about their own economies than they are with the agreements that they made with Japan. And so that leads to the rise of ultra-nationalistic militarists in Japan who believe that the way that Japan can best get the resources it needs is through conquest. And so the result here is the invasion of China. So that is one element of nationalism. The other is that this ultra-nationalism in Japan and in Germany is teaching people that their nation is the best, and kind of by extension, other nations are not quite really human, and they're subhuman. And so you can see that kind of attitude here with the destruction of Nanking. So this is referred to, this event, as the rape of Nanjing, the rape of Nanking. And unfortunately, it's so commonplace in World War II that many Western students haven't even heard of this thing. So if you look at the destruction, it's on the same level of anything we would see in Europe, and yet it flies below the radar in places like the United States. And so the third thing that we're seeing is what a total war is going to look like this time around. And so in World War I, there was a targeting of civilians that occurred. The Germans were sinking ships with U-boats. The British were trying to blockade the Germans and prevent them from getting food. But here, in this example, we see a much more direct targeting of civilians, a greater belief, a stronger belief that civilians are actually part of the war effort. All right, so then we have this unchecked aggression. We're gonna focus a lot of attention on Germany, but before we get there, we're gonna look at unchecked aggression elsewhere. And so I mentioned the rise of militarism, militarist leaders in Japan. So technically, Japan still had a parliamentary government, so it's not totalitarian, but you could say that the government that it had was authoritarian. So it has the authority to shut down dissent and to kind of force through policies, and it was relying on that ultra-nationalist sentiment in order to get these things done. So the militarist leaders of Japan have concluded that the best way for Japan to get the raw materials they need for their industries would be to conquer other parts of Asia. Now, they're not going to put it in those kind of cold terms. The Japanese often thought of themselves as liberating places in Asia from European control. And so the Japanese start by invading Manchuria, which is the area to the north of China. And that was condemned by the League of Nations. And so the political cartoon that's in the top center shows all of the international agreements that the Japanese had signed that they violated in their invasion of Manchuria. But the League of Nations does nothing. It condemned the Japanese actions, but didn't do anything more. And so this just encourages Japan to do more. And Japan is going to invade China in 1937, and they're going to eventually annex Korea during this time. And you can see in the map on the bottom right that prior to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese are kind of inching across Asia, and the League of Nations isn't doing anything. And so we come back to the British and the French. They are the leading democracies in the League of Nations, and they just don't want a war. They don't feel like that anything that's happening in East Asia was worth a war. We see a similar type of aggression on the part of the Italians. So Mussolini is still the fascist dictator of Italy, and his version of nationalism revolves around the old Roman Empire. So he's going to restore the glory of Rome, he claims. And step one for the Italians would be getting revenge on Ethiopia, which had defeated Italy back in that wave of imperialism of the late 19th century. So the Italians are able to overcome the Ethiopians this time because the technology for total war has advanced. They can use bombers. And they can just fly planes over Ethiopian positions and drop tons and tons of bombs. Well, Ethiopia was a member of the League of Nations. So this should be the situation where the League of Nations says, enough is enough, we're not going to allow this, but they don't do anything. And so the League of Nations is that organization that will say, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that. If you don't stop doing that, I'm going to tell you again, stop doing that. And so the totalitarian and authoritarian leaders around the world just learned to tune out the League of Nations. And so the kind of environment that we're seeing here is that the Japanese and the Italians have violated international law and they've gotten away with it. And so the sentiment among other leaders like those in Japan and Italy is that this is something they can do as well. And so this is what I meant by the breakdown of international law. If international law breaks down, then there are going to be dictators out there that will look to assert themselves. And so we see this today in areas of the world where there is a lack of leadership when it comes to upholding international law. Places like Syria, there have been countries like Russia that have tried to make inroads there as a result. And so that is, again, kind of the lesson of the time. So let's move to Germany, because this is going to be ground zero for the start of the war. What Hitler wanted to create was a new German empire, a German Reich. This was the Third Reich, the Third Empire. And Hitler believed, in his form of nationalism, that all German-speaking people should live in his empire. So that meant expanding and ruling over all of those German-speaking people. So he had already begun, in order to create this German Reich, to dismantle provisions of the Peace of Versailles that blocked all German-speaking people from living in the same empire. So step by step, he violates provisions of the Peace of Versailles that easily could have been enforced by the British and the French, or the Americans, had they chosen to enforce them. And so one we talked about yesterday, that was the rearming of Germany. That was in violation of the Peace of Versailles. So when Germany begins to build its army, it doesn't have much of an army. They could be crushed by the French alone, and nobody does anything. Then Hitler takes an even greater gamble. So if you look at the map in the top center, you see that area to the west, which is the Rhineland. That's the area between Germany and France. That area had been demilitarized under the Peace of Versailles. And Hitler decides to send troops into that area in violation of the Peace of Versailles, and definitely threatening France. And France does nothing. And France alone could have crushed Germany. Britain alone could have crushed Germany. The United States alone could have crushed Germany. This was such a risk that Hitler's generals urged him not to send troops into the Rhineland. They thought it was suicidal. But he gets away with it. All right, so then the next step is to bring in people from outside Germany's borders into the Reich. And so that first meant the Austrians. So most of the people in Austria were German-speaking people. Hitler himself was from Austria. And so this was in violation of the Peace of Versailles, was in violation of the Locarno Pact. But in 1938, there is an event known as the Anschluss, when Austria and Germany are joined together. So Austria is annexed with Germany. And once again, people outside of Germany talked themselves into this being okay. This is just Germans joining Germany. So there's no big deal here. The big deal is this, that Hitler is violating international law. Nobody's stopping him. So which laws are going to be upheld is the question. And the more territory Hitler adds to Germany, the harder it's going to be to stop him eventually. So that leads us to his big demand. In September of 1938, Hitler demands that blue area right on the fringe of Czechoslovakia. That's the Sudetenland. So the Sudetenland was inhabited by many German-speaking people, and Hitler claimed that those German-speaking people were being persecuted by the Czechoslovakians. There was some truth to that, and so Hitler was able to get international support then for this idea of helping out the German-speaking people. What Hitler insists upon is that that territory needs to become part of Germany. Well, if that territory was added to Germany, it would leave Czechoslovakia totally vulnerable to an invasion. This was the defensive frontier. This was the mountainous area that the Czechs could use to hold the Germans back. So what happens is Hitler issues an ultimatum. He either gets that territory or he is going to start a war. That leads to a meeting known as the Munich Conference. So the Prime Minister of Britain, you see there in the picture, Neville Chamberlain, and so we have the Prime Minister of Britain, the Premier of France, Mussolini from Italy, and Hitler from Germany. So not Czechoslovakia. They're not invited. Not the Soviet Union. They're insulted because they're not invited. The United States is isolationist by this time, so it's not involved. And at the Munich Conference, it's decided by the British and the French leaders to give Hitler what he wants, which is the Sudetenland. And this is known as appeasement. Appeasement is a term that means conceding to somebody else, giving in to somebody else, even if it goes against your values. And so Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, was giving in to Hitler, even though he knew he was giving away somebody else's territory. He was violating Czechoslovakia's sovereign rights to that territory. So he thinks that what this will achieve is what he calls peace in our time. He goes back to England and he announces that he has achieved peace in this generation. There will not be another world war. He believed that since Hitler fought in World War I, that Hitler could be negotiated with, that he wouldn't be crazy enough to start another war. And so this is one of those powerful examples from the interwar period. Even to the present day, no leader, no strong leader wants to be seen as guilty of appeasement. And so when negotiations are held between countries like the United States and Iran, if those countries seem to be too far in favor of Iran, then American commentators and politicians will start throwing around the term appeasement, because no American president wants to be seen as appeasing the leader of Iran or any other country. And so again, there's been this kind of powerful example that's going to impact diplomatic relations from the period 1945 on. Because what has happened at this point is at any stage, the Allies could have stopped Hitler and chose not to. So now when they give Hitler the Sudetenland, he doesn't stop there. He invades Czechoslovakia and he takes Czechoslovakia as well. So it's going to be really difficult to stop Hitler at this point. All right, so this is what's going to lead us into the actual conflict. Hitler claims that he has one last demand, and that's it. He has just one more thing that he wants, and that is the area in Poland that's right around Danzig. So if you look on that map, that little strip of territory between Germany and East Prussia that separates Germany was called the Polish Quarter. At the Peace of Versailles, they had given that to Poland in order to make Poland what they called a viable country. They thought it needed access to the sea for trade in order to be a truly independent country. So Hitler says, I have one last demand. This is it. Once I get this, I'm done. I need the Polish Quarter, because it was inhabited, of course, by a lot of German-speaking people. And so this time, the British and the French say, no, we're not going to concede that to you. Well, Hitler isn't really sure that the British and the French are going to stand up for Poland, but he kind of hedges his bets. One of the things that really hurt Germany in World War I was the fact that they had to fight France on one side and Russia on the other, a two-front war. So Hitler signs with Stalin a non-aggression pact. This was a shock to the world. Hitler and Stalin, these two leaders who hated each other, these two leaders whose speeches mentioned wiping the other country off the map, had now signed an agreement that said they would not go to war. So that's the Non-Aggression Pact. That gives Hitler a free hand to deal with the British and the French. And so after he signs this Non-Aggression Pact, which secretly included a provision to split Poland between the Russians and the Germans, you have the first use of the German blitzkrieg warfare. So the Germans invade Poland using a new style of warfare, blitzkrieg warfare. This is lightning war. They're using tanks, they're using trucks, they're using planes to quickly move troops. And so in the bottom right map, you can see how the arrows are kind of looping around. And this is called a double pincher move, where you're double enveloping the army. You're surrounding armies. Once you surround them, they're cut off, they have to surrender, and you can eliminate large numbers of soldiers pretty quickly this way. And so unlike World War I, which was a stalemate, trench warfare, World War II is going to be a war of movement. It's going to involve quick-moving troops for the most part. And so Poland collapses almost immediately, but the British and the French do uphold their guarantee to Poland, which is that they would declare war. And so this is it. This is where World War II starts. So unlike World War I, where we could say, maybe it was Russia backing up Serbia, or maybe it was Austria's ultimatum, here it's very clear. The Germans invading Poland starts the war. But that only comes after leading democracies had allowed breakdown after breakdown after breakdown of world peace. They had allowed the Germans to violate international agreement after international agreement, the Versailles Treaty being one of them, but also the Locarno Pact, which Germany had signed voluntarily. They allowed the Japanese to violate international agreements in expanding, and in the meantime hadn't really done much to rein them in. And so the example that's set here is if nobody upholds international peace, then dictators like Hitler are going to take advantage of the power vacuum, and they're going to expand. And so this is precisely what we see in both Europe and in Asia. And so in Europe, the invasion of Poland starts the war. In Asia, it could be contended that the invading of China starts the war, but the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 definitely brings on a full-scale total war in that region. And so now we're going to have a more destructive war where civilians are targeted to an even greater degree, where there are even more horrifying genocidal actions taken on the part of the combatants.